The Jets are looking for a new offensive coordinator. It's very important to get this hire right. But there are some attributes certain fans and members of the media are focusing on that really are not that important. What things don't matter in a Jets offensive coordinator hire? We'll talk about them on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, January 17th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangrenNation.com. Thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. Well, the Jets are searching for a new offensive coordinator. Over the weekend, they had their first couple of interviews. There was Kevin Patullo, who is the Eagles' passing game coordinator. There's also former Colts offensive coordinator Marcus Brady, who was fired during the season and actually also signed on with the Eagles in a consultant role. So it's no accident that these were the first 2 interviews because they're both with the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles have their bye this week as they prepare for the divisional round of the playoffs. So the Jets got their first couple interviews out of the way, but it sounds like it's going to be a pretty extensive search. And on today's show, we're going to talk about things in an offensive coordinator candidate that really are not that important, but these are things that I keep hearing about. People are kind of focused on them, and I'm going to explain to you why certain things just don't matter all that much. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is experience. And this is one that I think is going to come into play a lot, because I think especially if the Jets hire a guy with a lot of experience, you're going to hear plenty of takes about how this is a great move because the Jets needed an experienced guy in here. And I think a lot of that's kind of like typical NFL media talk, because whenever a coach leaves under bad circumstances, the natural view is that you should hire somebody who's the exact opposite. You see this happen all the time when a team changes its head coach. You know, if there's a disciplinarian who lost games, they need to bring in the guy who reminds all the players coach who reminds everybody it's a game. Vice versa, if there's a players coach who doesn't do well, they need to bring in a disciplinarian to restore order. You know, I can't count how many times I've heard about, you know, a team has a head coach who has a defensive background who doesn't show passion on the sidelines. We need to get an offensive coach who shows a lot of passion, who shows a lot of emotion on the sidelines. These things don't really matter, and it amazes me when media members focus on these things because they watch the NFL and they know that these things don't really make a difference when we're talking about coaching quality. Great coaches come in all shapes and sizes. You know, some come from the offensive side of the ball, some come from the defensive side of the ball. Some, you know, are kind of more on the disciplinarian side, although less in today's NFL. You know, most guys need to relate to their players, but they command respect in some ways. What are the things that make a great coach? Well, I think this is one of the reasons the media struggles to analyze coaches. You know, these are guys who are organized. They're guys who understand how to get players to buy in. They command respect in one way or another. They know how to delegate things. The problem, though, is that for those of us on the outside, and pretty much every member of the media is on the outside, we have no way of judging these candidates. So when a coach is hired, we can't really tell how good they are because we're not there on the practice field every day. You know, even guys who are in the building interviewing guys at press conferences, they're not there for practice every day, so they don't really have a good sense of how good a guy really is. So instead we fall back on these things that, you know, you can see. You can see whether a guy pumps his fist if there's a big player, yells at a referee if there's a bad call. Unfortunately, these things don't really tell you how good a coach is. And I think it works this way also when we talk about assistant coaches in some ways. Mike LaFleur came in, and he was a guy without a ton of experience. Now, he had worked under Kyle Shanahan for a number of years, but obviously was a younger guy. This was his first real opportunity to be an offensive coordinator. So you look at this situation, and I think at the end of the day, you'd have to conclude this did not really work out all that well. How much of it was Mike LaFleur's fault? I would argue probably less than people are putting on him, but LaFleur clearly had some of the blame in the Jets' offensive struggles this year. So I think the danger is to look at this situation and say, well, this was an inexperienced guy who did not necessarily succeed. Therefore, if the inexperienced guy succeeded, then we should get a guy with experience. You could go either way on this. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing if the Jets hire a coach with experience. I want to make that clear. I'm not saying that one is better than the other. You could get a good coach with a lot of experience. You could get a bad coach with a lot of experience. You could get the next young, bright mind guy without much experience. I think that's what the Jets were hoping for 2 years ago when they hired Mike LaFleur, and unfortunately, for a number of reasons, it simply did not work out that way. Or you could hire a young guy who, on paper seems like he's an up-and-comer, but really just isn't ready to be a coordinator, which probably is more along the lines of what the Jets got with LaFleur. There are different approaches to this. I think there's a guy out there. He's on Miami's coaching staff. He's a longtime NFL coordinator. He was a coordinator with the Minnesota Vikings. He was a coordinator with Seattle for a while during their Super Bowl years. Darrell Bevell, and now he was on Jacksonville's staff a year ago. Now he's on Miami's coaching staff, and he's a guy with ties to Saleh because Robert Saleh, as you may know, early in his coaching career, worked on Pete Carroll's staff with the Seattle Seahawks, and Darrell Bevell at this time was the Seahawks offensive coordinator, a guy with a ton of experience. And I could just envision this, that if the Jets hire him, all the people in the media are going to talk about what a brilliant hire this is because he's got experience, and this will restore order to the Jets. Now, I don't think Darrell Bevell's an awful coordinator. I don't think he would necessarily be an awful choice. Now, I would question why you radically change the direction of your offense just to bring in Darrell Bevell, because I don't think he's terrible. I also don't think he'd be a stellar hire, but I can already hear this right now, that people would be going on and on about all this experience the Jets have added to their coaching staff, how brilliant it is, how an experienced guy is going to restore order. Well, it doesn't necessarily work that way. Some of the bright young minds in this league, haven't been coordinators yet, and there's kind of a balance to it, because an experienced guy, he's been through it before. You've seen a body of work. You've seen that he could do it. He knows how to manage an offense. I think anytime you get a first timer in a job, there are going to be some growing pains as you learn how to do a job. On the flip side, a younger guy, hasn't been around as long in a league that's seen quite a bit of change in offensive structure over the last 10 to 15 years. A younger guy might be more, and not always, but in many cases, a younger guy might be more willing to kind of throw convention out and embrace new ideas. Now, there are some older coaches out there who also are willing to adapt, so I can't say it's a 100% kind of thing, but sometimes there's a benefit to youth because you come in thinking fresh. You haven't been doing things the same way over and over for 15 to 20 years. And in a league where adapting is really important, sometimes a younger guy is the right hire. I guess the best way I could put this, and I kind of hesitate to put it this way because it's kind of a cliche. The Jets don't need a coach with a ton of experience. The Jets don't need a coach who is young and doesn't have any experience. The Jets just need the right coach, and that could come in any number of shapes and sizes. But I don't think it's a case where just because Mike LaFleur lacked experience, that means this next coach has to have experience. And if they get a coach with experience, it's guaranteed to be great. If they hire a coach with limited experience, it's guaranteed to go poorly. That's just not how it works. And really, all you have to do is look across the NFL to understand that that's the case. I don't think experience is something in and of itself that's that significant when we're talking about a coordinator hire. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I'll continue talking about things that I just don't think should factor into the Jets' decision at offensive coordinator. And I'm going to talk about plans for the most important position on the field, the quarterback position. Why doesn't that matter? Shouldn't it be important? Well, I don't think you can plan for a specific quarterback for the Jets next season, and I'll explain what I mean in a little bit more detail as we continue this Tuesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. The Jets season's over. They're looking for a new offensive coordinator. However, the NFL season continues this weekend. It's one of the great weekends of the year. It's the divisional round. The final eight in the NFL will go at it, and you can still play daily fantasy. This is how PrizePicks works. You pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry. And it's not competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. And PrizePicks offers projections on any sport that you watch. So it includes the NFL, but it also includes the NBA. It includes the NHL, college basketball, both men's and women's. It includes soccer. It includes esports, boxing, and disc golf. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's just that easy. They have safe and fast withdrawals, and they're currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. So if you deposit $50, PrizePicks gives you $50. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks gives you $100. And don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match of up to $100 using PrizePicks. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms. The Jets are looking for a new offensive coordinator, and there's lots of talk about the attributes this guy has to have. Well, I'm here to tell you that some of these really aren't that important, and that's what we're talking about on today's show. In the first segment, we talked about the role of experience, and my view is experience is not that significant. I think another thing the Jets need to avoid the trap of getting into is a guy who has a plan for a specific quarterback. And there are a couple of things I mean by this. So the first reason I say this is that there's an offensive coordinator out there with a lot of experience. His name is Greg Olson. And he worked with the Raiders for a number of years, some of Derek Carr's best years. And I think there could be a temptation in a situation like this, when Derek Carr is available, to go out and get Greg Olson. Because, first of all, Derek Carr, even though in theory he could be traded, he has a no-trade clause. So if the Jets want to get him, they have to convince him to come, because he's either going to be traded, and if he's traded, he'll have to waive the no-trade clause. And objectively speaking, if he's going to be traded, you're probably going to have to give him a new contract. Or he'll be cut, in which case he's a free agent, and you're giving him a new contract anyway. So you're going to have to try and attract Derek Carr. So I think there could be this temptation out there, especially if you decide you want to get Derek Carr, to say, hey, we'll get his offensive coordinator. That'll convince him to come. Now, why is this a bad idea? Well, if you followed the NFL last offseason, you saw a perfect example of why this idea is a bad one. It's because you could follow, it's a team that plays in the same division as the Las Vegas Raiders, the Denver Broncos. And the Broncos fired their head coach, Vic Fangio, and they brought in a new coach, Nathaniel Hackett. And listen, we don't know for sure that this is the reason they brought in Nathaniel Hackett. They never explicitly said it, but there's a lot of speculation, and I don't think it's completely unfair speculation that the reason that they did that for Nathaniel Hackett, they went out and hired him, is because Nathaniel Hackett came from Green Bay and had a good relationship with Aaron Rodgers. And of course, this time last year, Aaron Rodgers' future with the Green Bay Packers was very much up in the air. So there was a chance Aaron Rodgers was going to be traded. And look, Rodgers was also in a situation where he was going to have a lot of say over which team he went to. And look, the coach he loves is right there with Denver. Well, you saw how that worked out. As it turned out, Aaron Rodgers was not traded. I don't think the Jets can go into this offseason and think that they're going to get a specific quarterback. You don't know how the offseason is going to play out. There may be another team Derek Carr wants to go to that he just thinks is a better situation. Maybe he doesn't want to come to New York. I'm speculating. I'm not saying explicitly that that's necessarily the case. But I don't think you can plan on one specific quarterback when he's not on your roster. Now, this would be a different scenario if the Jets had their quarterback in place already and you were looking to match the right coordinator with him. If Derek Carr was already a member of the New York Jets, then I think that could have come into play. I would even say that should be an important consideration, which coach would be most comfortable with him. Then I could see it. But you don't know who your quarterback's going to be, and it's just too much of a high-risk maneuver to try and to hire a coach specifically to land one player, because the odds of that being the determining factor are probably pretty low. I mean, maybe it's the type of thing that could help the Jets out. Maybe it's the type of thing that could give them a little bit, maybe half a point or so in whatever the rating system is for Derek Carr, but you can't guarantee that you're going to get him. So I think it would be a very bad move to do something like that. And the other aspect of this that I would say is, I think this goes without saying, and I think most people would agree with this, they should not be hiring a coach with the idea that they're going to fix Zach Wilson. Now, I do think Zach Wilson, you probably hold on. And now, I don't know what the situation is in the locker room. I mean, I don't know whether Zach Wilson just is totally gone and just doesn't think he can do it in New York. But generally speaking, my view on Zach Wilson is that 2 years in, he was a guy who was probably overdrafted. He was much more of a project than the Jets thought he was. Really not a guy who was anywhere near ready to play. So I view him as the developmental quarterback. Sometimes you take your developmental quarterback on day 3 and you let him sit a couple of years and you try and let him work it out on the sidelines and on the practice field. That's what I think the Jets should do with Zach Wilson. You just forget for a second that he was the second overall pick, because that pick is gone no matter what happens. Now, you can pretend he's your guy going forward because you spent the second pick on him. There's something called the sunk cost fallacy, and that's, you have to do what's best for your franchise going forward. The fact that you spent the second pick on him at some point is irrelevant, because no matter what happens, you're never getting that pick back. So you just have to do what's best for your team going forward. I don't think the Jets are even going to consider what a coordinator's role in developing Zach Wilson will be. I think at this point, you look at the situation and you just say, you know what, you hope Zach can develop, but it's not going to be the determining factor in who we hire as an offensive coordinator. So I think what the Jets really need to do essentially is go out and find the best offensive mind they can get, the guy who messes best with Robert Saleh's views on what he wants from an offense, and the rest of it will take care of itself. And Robert Saleh has indicated the offensive coordinator is going to have some say in the quarterback the Jets get. He's not going to be the guy who makes the ultimate decision. That's a decision that will be made primarily by Robert Saleh and Joe Douglas. But of course, the offensive coordinator is going to have input. Again, I think it would be different if in a world where the Jets were going forward with Zach Wilson. Then I think you'd look at the situation and you'd say, okay, which coach is best for Zach Wilson? Which coach best fits what Zach Wilson wants to do? Or in a world where the Jets already had Derek Carr under contract, then you'd say, okay, we got this quarterback, we got to build this offense around him. What do we do? How do we maximize the quarterback? In a situation where you don't have the quarterback, I think it's a little bit different. So I think in the scenario the Jets are in right now, they just need to find the best offensive coach for them, the guy that fits best with Robert Saleh. And the quarterback situation has to take care of itself. And you get the quarterback. Hopefully the offensive coordinator has a good plan for that quarterback that you eventually get. You just can't know it right now. And hopefully the offensive coordinator is a guy who's adaptable enough to suit the system for the quarterback. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will close out this Tuesday episode of our podcast. We'll continue to talk about things that really don't matter all that much. And there's one last thing I want to talk about. Previous ties with Robert Saleh. I don't think they're that important, and I'll explain why as we close out this episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by BetOnline. Once again, it is one of the greatest weekends of football of the year coming up, the divisional round, 4 great games, the final 8 teams in the NFL. I remember not too long ago the Jets were playing on this weekend. I guess it was over a decade ago. But in any event, if you're a football fan, you got to love what's coming up. And if you want to put money down on these games because you're really confident about what's going to happen, you should know that BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get all the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. So it goes beyond pro football. We can talk basketball. We can talk hockey. You can talk any sport. They've got it all at betonline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. They are the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We are talking about the Jets offensive coordinator search. It's probably going to take a couple weeks for the Jets to get a coordinator. And this is just going based on what the Jets have said to us. The Jets could always be lying to us, but it doesn't sound like, based on some of the preliminary comments that have been coming out of Florham Park, like we're going to have a coordinator this week. It may take another week, maybe even two. My guess would be that the Jets would want to have a coordinator in place by the Senior Bowl because I think they'd want that coach to be part of the draft evaluation process. And it's difficult to put grades on players until you have an offensive system because every offensive system values different traits at different positions. So my guess is that they'll want to have somebody in place by the Senior Bowl, which is typically the week after conference championship games, week before the Super Bowl. And of course, they could always hire somebody sooner than that. Of course, also, when the Jets hired Mike LaFleur, he had big ties to Robert Saleh. And you knew that Saleh, if he got a head coaching job, was going to take somebody off the San Francisco coaching staff to be his offensive coordinator. I think that was pretty obvious because, first of all, he's a first-time head coach. Second, he worked in San Francisco, so that's where many of the offensive minds he knows are from. But third, they were really good on offense in San Francisco, so it makes perfect sense that Robert Saleh would hire somebody like Mike LaFleur as his first offensive coordinator. But now we're 2 years in. I talked about this a little bit the other day. When you are first hired as a head coach in this league, you have kind of a mindset, you have a plan for what you're going to do. Then a couple of years in, hopefully some of the things you set out actually came true. Hopefully some of your plan worked. But it's inevitable that not all of your plan worked exactly as you thought it would be. And it's your job as a coach to kind of adjust to that. And sometimes, it gives you an opportunity to take a step back and really think about whether you want to continue on the path you're on. Robert Saleh, of course, did bring in a San Francisco guy. He could very easily bring in somebody he's worked with in the past. Saleh, for a coach as young as he is, actually has a pretty extensive network. He's worked with a lot of different teams. He's worked with a lot of pretty impressive offensive names. But it's going to be interesting to see what direction he goes in because he could very easily continue on his path and take somebody else who's worked with, who will run something close to what the Jets ran schematically. If that's the case, I think it would be a sign that maybe Saleh and the Jets just felt LaFleur was not the right fit. That they, the general playbook, the general overall philosophies made sense, but LaFleur may just not have been the right guy for them at this point in his career. Or they could do something completely different. Robert Saleh might like to go out of his comfort zone. And if he's going to do it, this would be a good time to do it. Because, again, he's 2 years removed from being with San Francisco. At that point, it was very logical that he was going to try and implement something along the lines of the San Francisco 49ers. But Robert Saleh was never going to come here. And I think this is one of the great misconceptions. When you hire a coach off another team, they're not just going to grab a magic wand and turn you into their old team. So when the Jets hired Robert Saleh, he was not going to turn the Jets into the San Francisco 49ers. I'm sure there were elements of that team he wanted to implement, but every coach, when they're first hired, if they are worth anything, they'll think about the things their old bosses used to do, and they'll keep the things that they like, and they'll change the things that they did not like. And I think that's true beyond football, but I think it's especially true for first-time NFL head coaches. So I'm intrigued by what Robert Saleh is going to do, whether he's going to go with a guy he's coached with before, or whether maybe he'll expand his horizons a bit, because he hasn't really ever had a chance to think this extensively about what he wants from an offense. And, there are different ways systems are run these days. We're talking about personnel groupings. The dominant personnel grouping in this league right now is the 1 running back, 1 tight end, 3 receiver sets, and it's called 11 personnel. And if you ever hear these numbers, the first number is the number of running backs. The second number is the number of tight ends. So 12 personnel is 1 running back, 2 tight ends. The first number is 1 running back. Second number is 2 tight ends. 21 personnel is 2 running backs, 1 tight end. First number is running backs, 2. Second number is 1. So that's one area. Obviously, run-pass ratio matters quite a bit. The types of formations you run, the rate at which you run play action in your run game, whether it's zone blocking more predominant or man or gap blocking. These are all things that come into play. And it's an opportunity, I think, for Robert Saleh to kind of put his own stamp on the offense. We know Saleh comes from a defensive background, but when the Jets hired him 2 years ago, he was very clear that he wanted to run the entire football team. That even though he has more of a background on the defensive side of the ball, he was not going to just delegate the offense away. The offense was going to run as he wanted it to run. And at that point, really all he knew was the Shanahan offense. Well, now, and he kind of indicated this when he said, this is going to be a process. This is probably going to take a couple weeks, and they're going to cast a wide net. Saleh has some time to reflect on what did not work in Mike LaFleur's offense. And it could be a question of maybe a few tweaks here or there, bringing in somebody with a similar background to LaFleur. It could also be Saleh realizing that for him, maybe this is not the right system for him. Maybe he needs something totally different, or of course it could be somewhere in between. But I don't think it matters that much how much it matters that Robert Saleh coached with this guy before. Because it's kind of like experience. There are benefits and there are negatives. I think, somebody he's worked with in the past, clearly there are open lines of communication. Clearly they'd be comfortable working with each other. But bringing in somebody else give him a fresh mindset. It could show him a different way of doing things. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of attention paid to that. I just don't know that it's all that important. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. Once again, if you are listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a wonderful Tuesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow. Please send in your mailbag questions. We'll have our Wednesday mailbag show.